May 17, 1945. New York Harbor. 6:14 in the morning. A German woman pressed her face against the cold porthole glass and saw something that stopped her breathing. Not soldiers, not rifles, not the gray machinery of war she had spent 3 years surrounded by. She saw a woman in overalls standing on the dock, clipboard in hand, shouting orders at a group of American soldiers. And the soldiers obeyed, without question, without hesitation. Bosche. Her name was Liesl Hoffmann, 26 years old, former typist for the German army. She had survived bombing raids, starvation rations, and 2 weeks at sea in a cargo hold that smelled like diesel and fear. She thought she understood the world. She thought she knew what war looked like, what defeat looked like, what women looked like inside a world run by men. She was wrong about all of it. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is just getting started, and you don't want to be left behind. In the next 60 minutes, you're going to hear the story of what happened when over 200 German women prisoners of war were brought to American soil in the final months of World War II. What they witnessed didn't just change their understanding of America. It shattered everything they had been taught to believe about women power and freedom. By the time they returned to the ruins of Germany, they carried something no army could confiscate. A dangerous idea. That women could stand equal to men. Not someday. Not in theory. But right now. In 1945. In the middle of the most destructive war in human history. This is the story no propaganda poster ever told. The year is 1944. Germany is losing, though not everyone is willing to say it out loud. Allied forces have landed at Normandy. The Eastern Front is collapsing under the weight of the Soviet advance. Inside Germany, the war machine is running on borrowed time and desperate faith. Women across the Reich have been mobilized not as soldiers, not as decision makers, but as support. Nurses, typists, volunteers, mothers of future soldiers. The Nazi state had a very specific vision of German womanhood. Kinderküche Kirche, children kitchen church, 3 words that defined the borders of a woman's world. For Liesl Hoffmann, those borders had always felt suffocating, though she never dared say so. She had grown up in a small town outside Munich, the daughter of a postal clerk and a seamstress. Smart, quietly observant, with a memory for details that made her exceptional at her work. She could type 90 words per minute. She could organize a filing system faster than men twice her age. Her supervisor at the Army Communications Office had once said she was the most efficient worker he had ever seen, then immediately promoted the man standing next to her. That was the world she knew. Competence was expected. Credit was not. By early 1945, the Allied advance was closing in from every direction. American and British forces were pushing east. Soviet forces were pushing west. Germany was being crushed between 2 walls of steel. In this chaos, groups of German military personnel, including nurses, typists, communications workers, and volunteers, were captured as the front lines collapsed. They were not combat soldiers. They were women who had served the German war effort in administrative and support roles. Under the Geneva Convention, they were classified as prisoners of war. And under American military policy, they would be transported to POW camps on United States soil. The ship carrying Liesl and more than 200 other women docked in New York Harbor at dawn on May 17, 1945. The women had spent 14 days at sea with almost nothing to eat, sleeping in hammocks that swayed with every wave. They had survived on rumors and fear. Some believed they would be interrogated. Others whispered about hard labor in desert camps. A few had heard stories of POW camps so brutal that death seemed preferable. None of them were prepared for what actually waited on the other side of that gangplank. The dock was alive. That was the first thing Liesl noticed. Not the smell of salt water or the cries of the gulls. The motion. Everywhere she looked, people were moving with purpose. Cranes swinging cargo. Trucks reversing into loading positions. Officers calling out orders. And running through all of it like a current through water were women. American women. Not standing quietly at the edges. Not waiting for instructions from the nearest man. Working. Directing. Deciding. A woman in khaki trousers with a clipboard walked the length of the dock calling out names. A woman in overalls drove a forklift with practiced ease, reversing it precisely into position between 2 crates. 2 women in army uniforms stood at a table checking documents, one of them tapping her pen impatiently, when a male soldier was too slow with his papers. Liesel turned to the woman beside her, a nurse named Greta, who had spent 2 years near the Russian front. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Greta didn't answer. She was already staring. Whoa. By 1944, more than 6 million American women had entered the workforce in roles directly tied to the war effort. They welded the hulls of Liberty ships. They assembled the engines of B-17 bombers. They packed the ammunition cases, drove the supply trucks, ran the communications networks, and managed the administrative infrastructure that kept the entire American military machine functioning. When the men left for the battlefields, the women didn't step aside. They stepped forward. And they didn't step back when the war ended. The German prisoners didn't know the numbers yet, but they could feel the truth of them in every direction they looked. They were loaded onto trucks and driven inland. Through the window glass, Liesel watched America unfold like a film she couldn't quite believe was real. A woman behind the counter of a roadside diner. A woman driving a delivery truck arm resting casually on the open window. A billboard showing a woman in work clothes. Her arm flexed a look of absolute confidence on her face. "We can do it." Liesel pressed her fingers against the glass. They would let her show her strength like that, she whispered. In Germany, that image would have been called shameful. But the trucks stopped at a military rest station outside the city. The prisoners climbed out blinking in the morning light. Across the road, a group of women was unloading wooden crates from the back of a supply truck. Heavy crates. The kind that required real effort. They were laughing as they worked, trading jokes across the tailgate with the ease of people who had done this 1,000 times. Their hands were calloused. Their hair was tied back under cloth caps. They didn't look like they were performing strength for anyone's benefit. They simply were strong, and they knew it. And no one thought that was remarkable. One of the German women, a young nurse named Ruth, watched them for a long moment. Then she said quietly in German, "They work like men and smile." She meant it as an observation, but it landed like a question none of them knew how to answer. The processing camp was located in the Midwest, a collection of long white buildings surrounded by wire fences and the flat, wide-open landscape of the American interior. The prisoners arrived in the late afternoon, and the first person they encountered at the registration table was a woman. Corporal Mary Henley. Khaki uniform. Silver pen clipped to her breast pocket. She looked directly at each prisoner as she spoke, her voice carrying the calm, firm authority of someone completely comfortable with being in charge. "Welcome to the processing camp. You will be registered, examined, and assigned to barracks. Follow the lines and keep your identification cards ready. No shouting, no threats, just control." For women who had spent their adult lives in a society that insisted female authority was either invisible or illegitimate. Watching Corporal Henley run that registration table was genuinely disorienting. She issued orders to male soldiers. They followed those orders without a flicker of resentment. She corrected a mistake made by a male sergeant in front of everyone present. He thanked her for the correction. This was not a special occasion. This was Tuesday morning at a military processing center in rural America. Jets. Inside the building, the typewriters were constant. The clatter of keys filled every hallway, a rhythm of precision and purpose. Women sat at those typewriters, stamping forms, filing records, building the bureaucratic record of the war, one document at a time. A young prisoner named Ruth stared at the rows of women working and whispered, "So many of them. They trust them with everything." An American guard overheard her and responded simply, "They keep this place running." The medical inspection was conducted by an army nurse with the sleeves of her uniform rolled above her elbows and her hair tucked under a cap. Her movements were efficient and practiced. She addressed each prisoner by name, not by number. She administered a disinfectant wash, issued soap and clean towels, and recorded everything in a ledger with the focus of someone who understood that paperwork was not bureaucracy, it was care. The smell of lavender soap, mixed with disinfectant, was the first pleasant thing most of the prisoners had smelled in weeks. Outside the processing windows, military jeeps moved between the camp warehouses, driven by women in dusty trousers with scarves tied in their hair. They called to each other across the noise of the engines, adjusted cargo loads, made quick decisions without consulting anyone. They occupied physical space the way soldiers do. Completely. Without apology. One of the German prisoners, a woman who had worked as a seamstress before the war, watched them from a fence post and said very quietly, "Back home, women who took up space like that would have been scolded." She paused. Here it looks like they were born to it. That night in the barracks, the conversation continued past lights out. The women spoke in low voices about what they had seen. The woman with the clipboard at the dock, Corporal Henley's silver pen, the nurse who used their names, the farmers driving machines the size of small buildings. Each detail was examined and turned over like an artifact from an unknown civilization. Ruth said, "Did you see the way she looked the sergeant in the eyes? Like equals." Liesel nodded. In our country, even that could be dangerous. The silence that followed was the heaviest silence any of them had sat inside for years. Outside, the American night carried its ordinary sounds. Crickets in the grass, the sweep of a searchlight across the yard, the distant, persistent sound of typewriter keys still tapping somewhere in the administration building. Work continuing after sunset. Women's work, carrying the same weight as anyone else's. Liesel lay awake for a long time listening to that sound. Then she reached for the small notebook she had kept since the beginning of the voyage and wrote one sentence in the dark. In America, even the sound of a woman's work has authority.
Pasinse.
She didn't know yet what would happen next. She didn't know about the farms, the factories, the families who would open their homes, the nurses who would speak to them like human beings, the small moments that would one by one dismantle everything she had been taught to believe about what women were allowed to be. She didn't know that this was only the first night of a transformation that would follow her across the ocean and into the rubble of post-war Germany. But that sentence in her notebook was a beginning. And the women of the German POW transport had no idea that the next morning they would be taken outside the camp fences for the first time. That they would see something even more impossible than anything they had witnessed on the dock or in the processing room. In part 2, we go deeper. The prisoners are sent to work on American farms and in American factories. They stand next to women who have been running 200-acre properties alone for 3 years. Women who built warplanes with their own hands. Women who will look them in the eye and say something so simple it will hit like a punch. The land doesn't care who plows it. Only that it gets done right. What happens when the prisoners realize the freedom they're seeing isn't a performance for their benefit? That it's just Tuesday in America. Stay with us. The most powerful part of this story is only just beginning. Last time we left Liesel Hoffman in a dark barracks in the American Midwest, listening to the sound of typewriter keys still tapping after midnight, writing one sentence in her notebook. In America, even the sound of a woman's work has authority. She had seen women commanding soldiers at the dock, women running the processing center, women driving jeeps between warehouses without asking anyone's permission. It had shaken everything she thought she understood about the world. But that was only the dock, only the registration table, only the first 12 hours. What waited outside the camp fences would hit harder, and the women inside those barracks had no idea it was coming. Here is a number that matters. By 1945, nearly 3 million American women were working on farms under the Women's Land Army program alone. 3 million. That is more than the entire active German military force at the Battle of Stalingrad. And those women were not auxiliary. They were not support staff. They were running the machines, making the decisions, keeping American food production from collapsing, while the men were overseas fighting the very war that had put Liesel on that ship. The morning after their arrival, the prisoners were taken outside the wire for the first time. The trucks rolled through flat countryside past fields of corn that seemed to extend to the edge of the visible world. The sky was enormous here, a thing Liesel had not expected. She had grown up in a valley surrounded by hills. America felt like a country with the lid taken off. Everything visible, everything open. It made her feel exposed in a way she could not entirely name. The convoy stopped at a farm outside a small town. The land was enormous, 200 acres of it, and at the center of it stood a woman named Helen Turner. She was tall with the kind of hands that told a story without words. Calloused, cracked at the knuckles. Strong in the way that belongs only to people who have been using them every day for years. Her overalls were stained with oil. Her sleeves were rolled above the elbow. She was standing on the running board of a tractor that was still ticking from recent use, and she was talking to a soldier like she had done it 1,000 times, because she had. When the prisoners climbed down from the trucks, Helen looked them over with a calm, assessing gaze. Then she said simply, "They can start on the east field, by noon, if they move." The soldier nodded. The prisoners exchanged looks. The woman had just given orders to a uniformed American soldier, and he had not blinked. He had nodded and reached for his clipboard. Helen Turner's husband had been drafted in 1943. He had been gone for 2 years. In those 2 years, Helen had not let the farm fall. She had planted, harvested, repaired equipment, managed hired hands, negotiated with buyers, and kept 200 acres of American soil productive through 2 full growing seasons without him. She had done it because the work needed doing, because the country needed feeding, because there was no one else. She was not unique. Across rural America, thousands of women had stepped into identical roles when the men were called away. They learned to operate machinery they had never touched before. They learned to fix engines they had never studied. They learned quickly and completely that competence had no gender requirement. The German women worked beside Helen for several days. She taught them the tools without condescension, correcting their technique with the matter-of-fact patience of someone who cared more about the work being done correctly than about who was doing it. One afternoon, she paused while looking at the horizon and said, "The land doesn't care who plows it, only that it's done right." Ruth, who was working next to Liesel that day, heard it and went very still. She repeated it quietly in German. "The land doesn't care who plows it." Jiao. Back home, that sentence would have been dangerous. Back home, the question of who did what was never just about efficiency. It was about hierarchy. It was about keeping certain people in certain places. Here, a woman who owned 200 acres said it as casually as commenting on the weather, because for her, it simply was the weather. It was just the truth. Jiao. In the evenings, the convoy passed factories on the way back to camp. The windows of those buildings glowed yellow well after sunset. Through the open loading doors, the prisoners could see women bent over assembly lines drilling metal parts, stitching military uniforms, loading crates. The sound of machinery carried through the night air, mixing with the smell of oil and sawdust. Ruth pressed her face to the truck window and said quietly, "They build weapons, not just polish them." This was the distinction that mattered. In Germany, women had been praised extensively for their support of the war effort. Praised for sewing, for cooking, for raising children who would one day serve. But they were kept at a deliberate distance from production, from the actual construction of the instruments of power. The machinery of war was a masculine space. Women existed adjacent to it, serving it, but never inside it. Down here, American women were not adjacent to the machinery. They were inside it. They were operating it. They had built 300,000 aircraft since 1941. 86,000 tanks, more than 17 million rifles. The numbers were staggering, and behind every one of those numbers was a woman on a factory floor who had shown up, learned the job, and done it without being asked to apologize for being there. One afternoon, a Red Cross volunteer brought a stack of American newspapers and magazines to the camp. The prisoners gathered around them slowly, cautiously, the way you approach something you are not sure is real. The pages showed women in work clothes advertising war bonds, women managing small businesses, women in military uniform receiving commendations. The captions spoke of women's contribution to victory in language that treated them as full participants, not as charming footnotes. Liesel stared at one photograph for a long time. It showed a woman in a factory goggles, pushed up on her forehead, smiling at the camera with grease on her jaw. The caption read, "She built the plane that flew over Berlin." Liesel set the magazine down and did not say anything for several minutes. Then she said in German they let her have credit for it. The other women understood immediately. It was not the work that was astonishing. Women had always worked. In Germany, in every country, women had always worked. The astonishing thing was the credit, the recognition, the complete absence of shame in the image of a woman doing something powerful and being seen doing it. By 1945, over 18 million American women held paid jobs, filling nearly 1/3 of the national civilian workforce. They did not hold these jobs quietly. They did not hold them apologetically. They held them with the full backing of a government that had spent 4 years telling them their work mattered and meaning it. Inside the camp that week, the conversations in the barracks changed. They had been quiet before careful, full of the particular silence of people who are not sure they are allowed to say what they are thinking. Now they were louder, not reckless, but honest in a way that had not been safe before. One woman said, "If women can run offices and drive trucks, what else can they do?" Another answered without hesitating, "Whatever they decide to." A third said it differently. "What else have they always been able to do that no one allowed?" The question hung in the air of the barracks, and no one tried to answer it because the answer was becoming obvious with every passing day, and the obvious answer was everything. They had always been capable of everything. The limits had never been about capability. They had been about control. Yes, Marta. The woman who had worked as a seamstress before the war started keeping a separate notebook. Not a diary, a list. Every day she wrote down one thing she had observed about American women that would have been impossible at home. A woman correcting a man in a meeting. A woman driving alone on a highway at night. A woman telling a story at dinner that everyone listened to completely. A woman saying no to something she did not want to do and facing no consequences for the refusal. By the end of the second week, the list was 4 pages long. The guards noticed the change in the prisoners before the prisoners noticed it in themselves. They grew quieter in a different way, not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of people actively processing something large. They asked more questions. Their English improved quickly once they had reasons to use it. They wanted to know about wages, about schools, about whether American women could own property in their own names. Then the answer to that last question, yes they could, and many did, produced a silence that lasted nearly a full minute. But what was happening inside those fences was not conversion. It was not propaganda in reverse. It was something more honest and more lasting than either of those things. It was the experience of seeing with your own eyes a world arranged differently than the one you had been told was the only possible arrangement. Once you have seen that, you cannot unsee it. The old arguments stop working. The old justifications collapse under the weight of the evidence standing right in front of you, wearing overalls, holding a clipboard, calling out names in a clear and confident voice. One night very late, Liesl wrote a longer entry in her notebook. She wrote about Helen Turner on her tractor, about Corporal Henley at the registration table, about the woman in the magazine photograph with grease on her jaw and a plane behind her. She wrote, "We were told that our strength was in our silence, but their strength is in their voice. And the voice is louder, and the voice builds more, and the voice does not apologize. And I do not understand how we ever believed the silence was better." Then she stopped writing and looked at the ceiling in the dark for a long time. Because the question that was forming in her mind now was not about America. It was not about 1945, or the war, or the factories, or the farms. It was about what came next. It was about going home. To a country in ruins. To a society built on exactly the structures she was watching American women dismantle with every ordinary Tuesday of their lives. She was going to have to go back. They all were. The question was what they were going to carry with them when they did. And in part 3, that question becomes urgent, because the prisoners are about to be invited into American homes, into private kitchens and living rooms and Sunday dinners. And what they see there, not in the factories or the fields, but in the daily unremarkable intimacy of ordinary family life, will be the thing that finally breaks something open. Not a wall, something deeper, something they had been carrying since childhood. The moment is already coming, and none of them are ready for what it is going to cost them to see it clearly. In part 1, Liesl Hoffman stepped off a ship in New York Harbor and saw women commanding soldiers at the dock. In part 2, she worked beside Helen Turner on a 200-acre farm and heard the sentence that would follow her for the... It was the specific feeling of recognizing a loss you did not know you had suffered. Helga, the youngest of the prisoners in the Goodwill program, worked for a farm family outside town, where the wife Nora managed the household accounts, ordered the supplies negotiated with the grain buyers, and made every financial decision the farm required. Her husband did the physical labor. She did the numbers. This was not a temporary wartime arrangement. This was simply how they had divided things based on who was better at what. When Nora showed Helga the washing machine, she said, "This saves me hours every week. More time for reading." Helga stared at her. In wartime, Germany books had been controlled, certain titles removed, certain ideas made unavailable. Reading had been managed as carefully as food and ammunition because ideas like calories give people energy to do things the state might not want them doing. Here, a farm wife in rural America mentioned more time for reading the way you mention a pleasant Tuesday afternoon. As a small, ordinary pleasure, entirely her own, accountable to no one. One Sunday, a group of families invited the prisoners to church. The service itself was unremarkable by American standards. Unremarkable by German standards would have been impossible. Women sang in the choir, which Liesl had expected. Women played the organ, which she had expected. But then a woman stood at the front of the church and delivered a 10-minute address about a relief effort she was organizing to send supplies to civilian refugees in Europe, including Germany. She spoke without notes. She spoke with authority. She used numbers and logistics and a specific plan with a timeline and a budget. The congregation listened with complete attention. Several people, including men considerably older than her, asked questions afterward. She answered them with confidence and without deference. After the service, a woman named Grace offered coffee and cake to the visitors. She was perhaps 60 years old, with the manner of someone who had decided long ago that life was too short for indirectness. She sat beside Liesel and asked about her family, where they were, whether they were safe. She asked with real interest, the way you ask about people who matter. Then she said, "When all this is over for you, I hope you remember that kindness is stronger than fear." Liesel thought about that sentence for the rest of the day. It was not a political statement. It was not propaganda. It was not an attempt to convince her of anything. It was just a woman named Grace telling another woman something she believed to be true. And the reason it landed so hard was precisely because no one had been trying to make it land. There was no machinery behind it. No strategy. Just a person saying a true thing to another person over coffee in a church hall on a Sunday morning. Marta's list in her notebook had grown to 11 pages by this point. She had stopped organizing it by category. The entries came as they came, one observation after another, building into something that no longer fit neatly into any framework she had available for understanding it. She wrote they argue with their husbands and the marriage survives. She wrote the daughter wants to become an engineer, and no one laughs. She wrote the woman at the church made a budget, and the men listened to it. She wrote she said no, and they said fine, and that was the end of it. Each observation was small. Together they described a world where the question of whether women were capable of things had simply been abandoned, not answered, not debated, not resolved through legislation or argument. Just abandoned, the way you abandon a question, once the answer has been demonstrated so many times by so many people that continuing to ask it becomes absurd. In the evenings back in the barracks, the conversations had changed completely. They were no longer about what they had seen. They were about what came next. One woman said she was going to learn to type properly when she got home. She had used a typewriter in her army posting, but always felt like she was borrowing someone else's tool. She wanted it to be hers. Another said she was going to find out whether the university in her city had reopened and what it would take to apply. Ruth said very quietly that she was going to teach differently when she went back to her village school. That she was going to teach the girls the same things she taught the boys, and she was going to do it without apologizing for it. Liesel said nothing that night. She lay awake listening to the town sounds drifting over the fence and thinking about Mrs. Parker washing dishes beside her and saying, "Why not? We both have dreams." In that flat, ordinary voice that treated equality as furniture, as something so basic you barely notice. It's there until you've lived somewhere that doesn't have it. She was going home to a country that had been burning for 12 years, the rest of her life. The land doesn't care who plows it, only that it's done right. She had seen factories running after midnight with women at every machine. She had watched American women occupy space, claim credit, and speak without apology. And at the end of part 2, she was lying in her bunk asking the hardest question of all. What do you carry home when home is in ruins? Now the prisoners are being invited somewhere new, not into fields or factories, into homes, into kitchens and living rooms and Sunday dinners, where the real structure of American life is visible not in policy or propaganda, but in the unremarkable details of how people actually treat each other. This is where the final wall comes down. Here is what the prisoners did not know when they arrived in America. The transformation they were witnessing had not been given to American women. It had been fought for quietly across decades and then rapidly accelerated by 4 years of a war that needed every capable person it could find. The number is 40%. That is how much American industrial output increased between 1941 and 1945. 40% built largely on the labor of women who had never worked in a factory before and learned in weeks what experts said would take months. The enemy had noticed. Germany's own military analysts had filed reports as early as 1943, noting that American production capacity was defying every projection. They couldn't understand it. They had not accounted for what happens when you stop telling half your population to be quiet and start asking them what they can do. Now the prisoners were about to see the source of that capacity in its most ordinary form. The Goodwill program began in the autumn of 1945. Trusted prisoners, Those who had caused no trouble, learned enough English to communicate, and demonstrated a willingness to work without resentment, were selected to help local families with housework and farm chores. It was a practical arrangement. Labor was still short in many communities. And it was for the American families involved an act of deliberate humanity, a choice to look at a former enemy and offer something harder than forgiveness. Normalcy. Liesl was assigned to a teacher named Mrs. Eleanor Parker, who lived in a white clapboard house at the edge of a small town and taught 4th grade at the local school. Liesl expected to be handed a mop and pointed at a floor. Instead, Mrs. Parker opened the door, handed her an apron, and said, "We'll do this together." They washed dishes side by side. They talked about the weather. They talked about childhood carefully across the large silence of the war that sat between them. Mrs. Parker asked about Liesl's town in Bavaria. Liesl asked about the school. Then Liesl asked where Mr. Parker was. Mrs. Parker told her he was away studying to become a doctor on the GI Bill, a government program that paid for veterans to attend university. Liesl paused with her hands still in the water. "Your husband is studying, while you work full-time and run the house." Mrs. Parker looked at her without any particular expression and said yes. "Why not?" "We both have dreams." 4 words. Why not? We both. In German, the sentence would have required an explanation, a justification, a careful navigation of social permission. Here it was said the way you say, "pass the salt." As a fact so basic it barely needed stating. Both people in the marriage had dreams. Both people pursued them. The arrangement required no defense, because no one was asking for one. Liesl finished washing the dishes, and did not say anything for a long time. Ruth was assigned to a farm family named the Hendersons. The father was back from the Pacific, still quiet in the way that men come back quiet, but present and gentle with his wife and children. What Ruth noticed immediately was the dinner table. Everyone talked. The wife disagreed with her husband about something in the news, and said so directly, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. He listened. He reconsidered part of his position. She listened back. The children watched their parents do this the way children watch everything their parents do as instruction in how the world works. Back home, Ruth had watched her mother become smaller every year. Not physically, something harder to name. Her opinions had narrowed, her voice had lowered. The range of things she was willing to say aloud had contracted season by season until she spoke mainly about weather, food, and the health of neighbors. Ruth had absorbed that contraction as a model, had begun without realizing it to practice the same narrowing in herself. Sitting at the Henderson dinner table, watching a woman speak her opinion and be heard something in Ruth's chest did something complicated. It was not quite grief. It was not quite anger. The physical fires were out now, but the other kind, the kind that burns in the structures of how people think about each other and what they allow each other to be, those were still very much alive. She did not have a plan. She was 26 years old. She had a notebook with sentences in it, and she had seen a world arranged differently than the one she had been born into. She wrote in the notebook that night, "We thought freedom was something you fought for with weapons, but the most dangerous freedom I have seen here is the kind that lives at a dinner table. That says disagreement without punishment. That teaches a daughter she can become an engineer. That washes dishes with a stranger and calls it together. That kind of freedom does not come from winning a war. It comes from deciding one Tuesday at a time that a person is a person regardless of what they are." She stopped writing and looked at the ceiling. The repatriation papers had arrived that week. Within 60 days, they would be on ships heading east. Back to the rubble. Back to the silence. Back to a Germany that was going to have to decide from the ground up what kind of country it intended to become. And part 4 begins with that ship pulling away from the harbor, with Liesl at the porthole watching America grow small behind her. With 11 notebooks and 4 years of war and one question she cannot put down. What do you build in the ruins when you finally know what the building is supposed to look like? The answer is the last chapter. And it is the one that has never been fully told. Across 3 parts, we have followed Liesl Hoffman from a gray harbor in New York to a farmhouse kitchen in the American Midwest. We watched her see women commanding soldiers, running factories, owning land, and washing dishes beside strangers, while calling it simply doing things together. We watched her write sentences in the dark that she did not yet know what to do with. At the end of part 3, she was standing at a window with repatriation papers in her hand, and 60 days left in America, asking the question that the entire journey had been building toward. What do you build in the ruins when you finally know what the building is supposed to look like? This is part 4. The part about going home. The part about what happens after the education ends and the real work begins. And there is one detail at the end of this story that almost no one knows. A detail that changes the way the entire thing reads. Stay with it. The ships left in the spring of 1946. The women stood at the railings as New York Harbor grew small behind them and then disappeared into the gray of the Atlantic. Most of them were silent. The ocean looked the same as it had 8 months earlier when they crossed it the other direction, terrified of what waited for them in America. Now they were terrified of something different. Of going back. Of finding that everything they had seen and written and quietly decided inside themselves would be impossible to live in the place where they had been formed. Liesl stood at the railing for a long time after the harbor vanished. She had 11 notebooks. She had learned enough English to carry a real conversation. She had learned to drive a tractor, to use an American typewriter to make apple pie from a recipe card that Mrs. Parker had pressed into her hands the morning she left. She had a list of things she intended to do written in careful German in the last notebook that filled 3 pages. Germany in 1946 was not a country. It was a problem. 70% of its urban housing had been destroyed. 12 million refugees were moving through the rubble of its cities, looking for something that resembled their former lives and not finding it. The government that had defined the last 12 years was gone, replaced by occupation zones and the slow, painful machinery of rebuilding something from near nothing. Every structure, political, social, physical, was either destroyed or under serious question. For Liesl and the women who had returned with her, this was grief. Of course it was grief. These were their cities, their streets, their language. But underneath the grief in the part of themselves that had been quietly reconstructed across 8 months in America, there was something else. Something that the rubble made possible in a way that an intact society might not have. When everything is already broken, the question of what gets built next is genuinely open. Liesl went back to her hometown outside Munich. Her mother was alive. Her father had died in the last year of the war, a fact she had known from a letter but not yet absorbed in her body until she walked into the house and saw the specific absence of him in the chair by the window. She sat with her mother for a week, saying very little, helping with the practical work of survival that occupied every waking hour in post-war Germany. Then she went to the town's administrative office and asked about reopening the school. The school had been closed for 14 months. There were children in the town with nowhere to be educated, parents who could not afford to send their children to the city, and a building that was structurally sound, but missing its roof on one side, from a bomb fragment that had landed too close in the winter of 1944. Liesl went to the building with 2 other women from the town, assessed what needed fixing, made a list of materials, went to the occupation authority's office, and asked for what she needed with the direct, prepared confidence of someone who had watched Corporal Mary Henley run a military processing center and taken notes. She got most of what she asked for. The school reopened in September 1946. Ruth returned to her village and began teaching again within 3 months. She taught the girls mathematics and science at the same level she taught the boys, without announcing it as a policy change, simply by doing it the way you do something you have decided is simply correct. When a parent complained that his daughter did not need geometry, Ruth told him that the land did not care who plowed it, only that it was done right. He did not understand the reference. He understood the tone. He did not complain again. Marta the seamstress, who had kept 11 pages of observations, opened a small alterations shop in her town within a year of returning. Not a large ambition by any measure, but she ran it herself. Kept her own accounts, hired a young woman as an apprentice, and paid her a fair wage, because she had seen what it looked like when women's work was credited, and she had decided in her specific, quiet way to practice that in the space she controlled. Greta the nurse, who had served near the Russian front, returned to nursing, which she had done before the war. The difference was how she did it. She had always been skilled. Now she was also assertive, advocating for her patients in ways that nurses in the German medical hierarchy were not expected to behave. She was reprimanded twice in the first year. She continued anyway. None of these women became famous. None of them are in history books. Liesl Hoffmann does not have a statue or a street named after her. What she has is the school she reopened, which educated children for 30 years before she retired. and the particular quality of those children's education, which several of them in letters written decades later to her successor, described as having been taught to think for themselves in a time and place where that was not the obvious lesson. The legacy of what those women brought back from America cannot be measured in a single number or mapped onto a single event. It spread the way most real change spreads slowly, person by person, decision by decision, in the small daily choices of people who have seen a different possibility and cannot entirely unsee it. In the post-war reconstruction of West Germany, women's participation in civic life increased substantially through the late 1940s and 1950s. The Basic Law of 1949, West Germany's founding constitutional document, included Article 3, men and women shall have equal rights. It was not implemented immediately or completely, but it was written. It was there. And the people who pushed for it, argued for it, refused to let it be quietly set aside, were doing the work that invisible transformations require, which is the patient repeated insistence that a thing you know to be true should be treated as true. Here is the BII lesson that the story of these women teaches, and it is not a lesson about World War II specifically, though. The war is where it happened. It is a lesson about what occurs when people are shown, rather than told, that a different arrangement of the world is possible. Propaganda works by repetition. It works by isolating people from contradictory evidence and repeating the same claims until they feel like facts. The thing that undoes propaganda is not counter-propaganda. It is not argument. It is direct, unmediated experience of something real. Liesl Hoffman was not converted by a speech or a pamphlet. She was converted by a woman with a clipboard at a harbor dock at 6 in the morning. By a corporal with a silver pen who addressed everyone by name. By a farmer who said the land does not care who plows it. By a teacher who washed dishes beside her and said, "Why not? We both have dreams," in the flat tone of someone stating a fact so basic it barely needs saying. Experience is the most powerful argument in existence, and the Americans, without designing it as a program or intending it as education, gave these women 8 months of direct experience of a world where the question of what women could do had been functionally abandoned because the answer was too obvious to keep debating. The women carried that experience home in 11 notebooks and in their bodies, and in the specific, quiet, accumulated weight of having seen something that could not be unseen. Now here is the detail that almost no one knows. The one that reframes the entire story. In 2019, a German historian named Dr. Anneliese Vogel was researching post-war social reconstruction in Bavaria when she came across a collection of personal papers that had been donated to a regional archive in Munich by the family of a woman who died in 2001. The papers included diaries, letters, notebooks, and a small handmade booklet, 16 pages hand-sewn at the spine, that the woman had apparently produced sometime in the late 1940s. The booklet had no title page, but it contained in careful handwriting a series of observations about American women written during what the text described as 8 months in America in 1945 and 1946. The observations were specific, precise, and extraordinary in the way they captured small moments. A woman correcting a sergeant, a farmer on a tractor, a teacher saying, "Why not? We both have dreams," in a tone that treated it as furniture. Dr. Vogel identified the handwriting as belonging to a woman named Elizabeth Hoffman, known to her family as Liesl, a former typist for the German army who had been processed as a prisoner of war in New York in May 1945. She had returned to Bavaria in spring 1946 and reopened a primary school in her hometown where she taught for 30 years. The booklet had been written, the family told Dr. Vogel, for the girls in Liesl's first class, not as a history lesson, not as a political document, as a letter. An account of what she had seen written in language a child could understand, given to her students at the end of their first school year in 1947, because she wanted them to know while they were still young enough to build their lives accordingly, that the world could be arranged differently than the one they had been born into. Most of those girls are gone now. Some of their daughters and granddaughters are still alive. One of them, speaking to Dr. Vogel in an interview recorded in 2019 and now held in the archive, said that her grandmother had kept the booklet her whole life and read from it to her own children. She said her grandmother described Liesl Hoffman as the first person who ever told her directly that her life belonged to her. Shaky. The booklet's final sentence, written in the careful hand of a 26-year-old woman sitting in the ruins of her country with 11 notebooks and a list of things she intended to do, reads as follows. You do not need permission from the world to become what you are capable of. You only need to see once clearly that it is possible. And then you need to be brave enough to remember that you saw it. And from a typist with a notebook and a question she could not put down to a classroom in Bavaria that opened in September 1946 and taught for 30 years to a handmade booklet passed from grandmother to granddaughter across 7 decades. Liesl Hoffman proved that the most enduring weapon any country possesses is not its bombs or its factories or its armies. It is the simple radical act of showing another human being what freedom looks like in ordinary life. On a Tuesday morning, at a harbor dock, over dishes, in the flat, undefended voice of someone who has never once been told to make herself smaller and therefore simply never has. That is why this story is worth telling. Because the women who changed Germany after the war did not do it with weapons. They did it with memory. With the specific, accumulated, unshakable memory of having seen something real. And the courage to insist for the rest of their lives that what they saw was not a dream, but a blueprint.